Can it throw a 1/2 ounce and a 3/4 ounce? Can it do a Texas rig and a football jig? These are questions that we literally get every single day. Questions about jig rods. Now, if you are a bass fisherman, jig fishing is something that is super important and just it's a paramount piece of our bass fishing game. So it's no doubt that a jig rod and jig rod questions are always prevailing. So when Megabass came out with Destroyer P5 and they brought 2 jig rods, including the X Bites, everybody got super stoked, and we get so many questions about what is this rod good for? Is this the best jig rod that Megabass has ever made? Today, we are going to break this down fully. I'm going to show you guys exactly what this rod is great at, what this rod isn't great at, so that you can decide, could this be the best jig rod you've ever owned? Let's go. Welcome to the Hookup Tackle. The Hookup Tackle is the world's largest showcase of Megabass products, featuring baits and colors not found at any other dealer. The Hookup also offers a wide display of OSP, Evergreen, Depths, Lucky Craft, Jackal, and many more. The Hookup Tackle is owned and operated by family, is staffed by guides and verified tackle nerds who love helping anglers elevate their craft. If you're in the Phoenix area, we'd love to have you stop by our showroom and check out the wonderful world of Megabass and the Hookup for yourself. If you shop online, there are almost 10,000 SKUs of Megabass products alone, with hundreds of other companies and new products being added daily. So next time you're looking for that hard to find bait, that color your fish have never seen before, or maybe you just want to elevate your game, look at thehookuptackle.com. All right, welcome back, my friends. I am Ben with the Hookup Tackle, aka the Tackle Otaku on Instagram, being joined by my buddy Desert Bassin. This is weird, dude. CJ, what's up, dude?
How's it going, brother? Good morning.
Congratulations on losing the 1v1
Hey, but I'm here.
contest, but you got the job anyways. The people loved you.
Happy to be part of it, man.
I loved you too because you gave me more competition than Griff. So, welcome, sir. This is weird for me, not having Jeff there, but fuck that guy. We don't need Jeff.
We're out here.
Yeah. So, today, I'm doing a video that I've wanted to do for a while, and that's a full review of the Destroyer P5 X Bites line. And I'm going to also include the other jig rods of the Destroyer P5 line into a lot of this conversation. So we're going to talk about the Dark Sleeper, we're going to talk about the Tachyon Shaft, we're going to talk about the X Bites, because it's important to understand what those rods were built for too, so you can understand this rod. But this rod in particular, the X Bites, is a rod that has probably been the most asked about rod of the last couple of years. And, you know, jig rods are something that, you know, as bass anglers, we're always kind of evolving our jig rod collection, right? It's important that we have the right powers, the right sensitivities, and jigs are also kind of evolving a lot too. You know, when I think back, you know, 10, 15 years ago, and we were throwing football jigs, we pretty much were all just throwing like a normal, like a full-size football jig and a 5-inch trailer, right? Or a hula grub and a big football jig. But now football jigs come in so many different styles, varieties. There's full-size, there's finesse. You got things like the OSP Hunts jig and the Depths headlock jig and these, you know, compact tungsten jigs, right? So things are getting smaller and things are getting bigger, and there's just so many different options, and rods are kind of in that same lane. Some are focused towards one, some are focused towards the other. You've got swim jigs, you've got finesse jigs, you've got pitching jigs, you've got so many different options, and that's just in jigs. You've got Texas rig and free rig and all these other things that are bottom contact related, and not every rod is built the same. So, you know, we've had these rods now for about 1.5 years in our arsenal. We've got very intimate with these rods. I'm confident now in knowing what these rods shine at, what these rods excel at, and where the weak parts are of these rods, so that we can have an open discussion and we can find out, is this rod the perfect jig rod for you? So let's let's dive in. So first off, let's talk about the rod that we're really here to talk about, and that is the Destroyer P5 X Bites. Now, when Megabass launched this series, this was kind of a unexpected surprise, I would say, in the lineup. Now, I've been a Loomis guy since I was born. I'm in Arizona. If you're born in Arizona, you're born with a Loomis rod. And I started adding Megabass rods years and years ago into the lineup to fill gaps, and became fans of Megabass rods as well. One thing that Loomis has always been famous for and always known for are their bottom contact rods and their sensitivity. Especially when NRX became a thing, it really became the upper echelon of sensitivity, and it's probably the blank that is asked about the most often as far as comparison. Well, how does that compare sensitivity to an NRX? How is that action compared to an NRX? That's really kind of the industry standard for jig and worm fishing. And because I have used Loomis and NRX basically since it's been a thing, that's naturally how I compared the Megabass jig rods as well. Well, how's it going to compare to the rods that I already have, and does it even have a place in my line? So that's where a lot of my background is going to come from as I'm talking about this. Now, unlike most rod manufacturers that build basically multi-rods in every little genre, right? For instance, most rod manufacturers, like a G-Loomis for instance, they have to start somewhere. So usually they start with like a 7-foot medium heavy rod. They get it to where they want it. They stiffen it up a little bit to make a 7-foot heavy. They lighten it up a little bit to make a 7-foot medium. And then bing, bang, boom, they have 3 rods in the 7-foot realm, a medium, medium heavy, and a heavy. Moving on, they do the same thing with a 7.6, right? They do the same thing with a 6.10, right? So that's the general way of building rods for a company. Megabass has never been like that. They've always built each rod independently, one rod at a time, for specific uses. Now, Megabass is the biggest rod company in Japan. They are becoming a huge force in fishing rods, but Megabass is a lure brand, right? Everybody knows Megabass, famous for the Edo Vision 110, for the Pop Max, right? They are a lure brand. So as they're building rods, they're really building rods that are specific to the baits that they are building, so that you could have the ultimate jerk bait and then the ultimate rod to throw that jerk bait on. And this has always kind of been the mindset of Megabass and how they're choosing their models, right? So when we see a new line of Destroyer P5s come out a couple years ago at the Osaka show, and there's 3 jig rods, like 3 dedicated jig rods in the line, it's kind of crazy because this isn't really a jig company. Megabass isn't famous for the jigs. Now, they've got the Waze swimmer now. They've got, of course, the Dark Sleeper. That's a swim bait jig kind of hybrid. But this is really interesting because jig style baits is where the brand is focused on expanding and growing, right? So it's exciting to see them pre-thinking about this with the rods and getting the rods established first, so that the baits can then come to complement the rods. And that's what is really exciting about this line. Now, at first, when we see the specs between, these 2 rods, this is the X Bites and this is the Dark Sleeper, these were the 2 rods that were really kind of confusing, I guess, in a way, right? They're both very, very similar. The X Bites is a 7.2, right? And it's an f5.5 7.2. Right, so kind of a true heavy power 7-foot 2-inch, and the Dark Sleeper is a 7.1 f4.5, so kind of a medium heavy, right? So the Dark Sleeper obviously makes sense. It's probably designed to throw a Dark Sleeper, right? But what is the X Bites right for, and how do we break that down? So let's jump in and start really digging through this. First off, if you guys are familiar with the Destroyer P5 line, you'll know that they're all incredibly light. They're, featherweight, just like any high-end rod's going to be. They have a smaller trigger on them than a traditional rod, so they fit in your hand very comfortably no matter where you end up putting your hand on that grip. You don't have a big pointed trigger, so it's nice and comfortable, and it's got a soft cork. Your finger is almost always going to be on some type of metal up on the front, so you're going to get max sensitivity transfer from the blank to your hand. So, you know, they're beautiful rods, they're gorgeous rods. All of the Destroyer P5s are built in a 5D graphite, right? So what that means is it's all kind of a woven graphite versus just all the graphite running one direction. What that does is it allows the rod to basically have no spline. It's going to have the same power if you're setting the hook up and down, left and right, to the side, right, whatever direction. It's also going to have the same sensitivity in any of those directions. So you don't have to necessarily be pointed directly at the bait to have max sensitivity. You could be off to the side, you could be at a strange angle, you could basically be however you want to be, and it's going to have that same sensitivity going through it. Now, when you see a 7.2 heavy, right, and you see a lure rating like what the X-Bites has, which is 1/4 to 1 ounce, it's pretty easy to just kind of assume like, well, that's going to be my 1/2 ounce and 3/4 ounce jig rod, because that's right in the wheelhouse and in the middle of, you know, where it's telling me it should be. It's a 7.2 heavy, and historically, a 7.2 heavy means that should be a pretty powerful jig rod, right? Now, because this is built in a P5, this rod is super light, right? And just because it's heavy doesn't necessarily mean it's super stiff, right? And that's really kind of the asterisk to this rod and one of the special parts of this rod, okay? So you can see with very little pressure, right? Very little, I can get that tip to move, right? So I mean, I can barely put any pressure on this, and you can see that that tip is moving. And as I continue to push down, it's going to continue to bend through that top third of that rod. So even though it's a fast rod, it's got some kind of special give. It's almost more like a medium heavy at the tip, but it's got tons of power in the back side of this rod. So what's important to note about that, if we are comparing it to an NRX, the likely comparison would be the 854. This is the NRX Plus 854. This is a 7.1 heavy. So 7.1 heavy instead of 7.2 heavy, right? Very, very comparable rods. You can see that with that same amount of pressure, I don't get quite as much bend here at the tip. I get some, but this is a much stiffer, much faster, much heavier, heavy rod. Okay, so I got to really kind of put some arm in there to get that rod to kind of give that same amount of bend. The reason why this is important is it's going to be important for you guys to understand what type of jig this rod really shines at using and what type it's going to fall a little short in comparison to something like an NRX. So let's dive into that. What does this rod do well? Well, because this rod has a little bit softer tip, right? The advantage of that is with a very small little movement, that rod tip is going to give you some performance, okay? And where that really shines is in compact jigs, something like a depth headlock, something like an OSP Hunts, a smaller, lighter, a little Kitech tungsten football jig, something like that. This rod has the ability to make these ultra small little movements, right? You can literally lift that tiny little jig and crawl it one rock at a time, and that tip is going to allow you to move it without pulling it too far, right? One of the problems with jig fishing is, you know, if we're throwing a jig down the bottom, more than likely we're imitating some form of crawdad, right? Now it could be a goby or it could be a bluegill or, you know, obviously whatever they're feeding on, but day in and day out when we're throwing a jig, we're thinking about it in terms of a crawdad. And when you watch a crawdad moves very, very slowly, right? So if this is a rock, a crawdad moves very slow. And even when it's like, it gets scared and moves away, it might do a little burst and then down, right? A crawdad is never moving 5, 6 feet at a time, 8 feet at a time, and then falling, right? That's just not natural. Well, if you have a 7.1 or a 7.2 jig rod, right, and you are doing a big pull and then winding down, it's laying on the bottom, you're lifting it all the way up, right, and then you're winding it down the bottom, you're lifting this rod 7, 8, 9 feet at a time, and that bait is doing these huge movements. And historically, we've almost had to do that because the rods are so stiff that, you know, even a small movement, the rod isn't really bending at all and giving it all, it's just pulling. So if we move a foot, that rod is basically pulling that bait a foot. If we move the rod 3 feet, it's pulling that bait 3 feet, right? So on these smaller, more compact jigs that have become super popular, here's one I pulled out of my boat this morning just to make sure that we're all on the same page of what we're talking about. Like, this is a little OSP hunch jig, a little 3-inch doe live crawl. You can see it's small, right? But you can still get these jigs in, you know, 3/8, half, 5/8, 3/4 ounce, 1 ounce even, right? But they're really compact. So if your rod is too heavy and too stiff, when you go to move this jig, instead of getting this small little lifelike movement out of a jig that looks like a crawdad, you end up pulling it, you know, feet at a time that doesn't look anything like anything, especially if you're really trying to pinpoint and get specific in a little rock pile. And this is the type of bait that this X-Bites really shines at. If you guys find yourself throwing these smaller, more compact jigs, I would say anymore, I'm probably throwing these smaller compact jigs at least half the time now, versus like a full-size dirty jig with like a 4 or 5 inch craw trailer or a double tail or something like that. CJ, when you're jig fishing, are you throwing more compact jigs now? Are you throwing full size, or what's your blend?
Oh, I love finesse jigs.
Okay, so you're throwing a lot of these as well.
Yep.
Yeah, so this is definitely becoming more the trend. I would say I would say across all lines. I mean, even, you know, companies like Dirty Jigs that are, you know, make arguably one of the best full-size football jigs on the market. Dude, they're making tons of finesse jigs now, right? So, you know, this is definitely the trend. We start getting into tungsten heads. They're going to be smaller, more compact. The jigs are going to be tinier, right? And that's becoming a trend. So these smaller jigs are definitely, I would say, outselling full-size jigs, probably 3-to-1, 4-to-1 in the store. And I would say that most guys fishing jigs now have these implemented at least into some part of their arsenal. Now, the reason why that this is important, I keep bringing this up, is, you know, you could get the Loomis line, right? So historically, I've used 894, 893, 894, 895 has been my jig lineup. If you didn't want the 7.5 version, you could do the 7.1 version, do 853, 854, right? But it's because we're fishing a lot of deep water, a lot of long casts, I've always liked that kind of 7.5, the 893, 894, 895. The challenge with those rods is because they're so long and because they are stiff and fast, is I've always found that I've struggled getting super accurate movements with the smaller baits. Now, those rods, if the most important thing to you is squeezing every single drop of sensitivity out and having the ultimate most sensitive rod, I still don't think you can beat this. All right, NRX is going to beat Destroyer in that category. But I would say from a sensitivity standpoint, Destroyer is probably 95% there to an NRX. I mean, it is so close, right? The advantage that you get in the X-Bites is for a little jig like this, when you want to make little tiny movements, this nice little softness that you get up here manages it so well, and you can literally feel yourself just pull that jig one rock at a time, one little movement at a time, and it's super controllable, right? Now, as far as weight goes, this is rated 1/4 to 1 ounce. I can tell you this rod is totally good in that 3/8 and 1/2 ounce. 5/8 it can absolutely handle. 3/4 it's going to start feeling like a sock, you're going to just be dragging some kind of like wet sock down there. It gets a little mushy because remember, the more weight you have, the more this is going to have to bend deep into the blank before you get any type of pull or any type of movement out of it. So if you guys are looking for a true dedicated, 5/8 or 3/4 ounce jig rod, you're going to be better off in Loomis. If you throw a 5/8 every once in a while, then yeah, you could throw it on here. But again, I'm still talking compact jigs. Remember, we have to take the weight of the trailer into consideration too. So if you have a 1/2 ounce compact jig and a little 3-inch trailer, you're at 5/8 or 3/4 ounce, which means you're in the wheelhouse of what this rod can do. It performs well. But if you're starting at a 3/4 ounce jig and you're putting a trailer on there, you're going to be at an ounce or more, which is going to be above what this rod is designed to do. And you can feel that it's above what this rod is designed to do. So at the end of the day, if you're throwing little compact jigs, if you're throwing light Texas rig, if you're throwing things that you need controlled, precise movements on, I'm choosing the X-Bites. I love this rod. I mean, don't get me wrong. I freaking love the new NRX, and we've been blown away by them. And for my full-size jig offering, I'm throwing a full-size football jig, or I'm throwing a 3/4 ounce jig with a full-size trailer, which is what I throw a lot. This is not replacing my 894, not replacing my 895, right? Like they've got to stay. But for these smaller, lighter, more compact jigs that need precise movements, the X-Bites crushes. Now, let's talk about the comparison between the X-Bites and the Dark Sleeper, since we brought that up. And while we're talking about the X-Bites, let's just cover it. Now, why do you get the X-Bites or why do you get the Dark Sleeper? Now, if we think of the Dark Sleeper rod and we think of the Dark Sleeper bait, Dark Sleeper is a swim bait that is designed to be fished like a jig, right? So the Dark Sleeper is going to have an even deeper bend to it, okay? You can see that it bends further down into the blank, almost to the middle section of the rod, I would say, okay? This rod was designed to be super sensitive, but only when it's under load, okay? If you're looking for a slackline sensitivity rod, you're going to want to get the X-Bites. And what I mean by that is if you're crawling a jig up and over a rock and then it comes over the top and then it's going to fall and kind of free fall, and you want to feel that fish suck it in on a slack line, you're going to need this rod. You need the faster rod. You're not going to be able to feel that the same way with the Dark Sleeper because it just bends too deep, right? The rod's going to absorb that bite and that little pressure bite out there if the rod is under load. Now, once this rod is under load and it has a little bit of bend to it, the sensitivity is lightning fast to your hand. So for something like a swim jig, which is really what this was designed to do, right? Dark Sleeper is essentially a swim jig. Was a swimmer, spinnerbait. Like I love this rod for throwing a spinnerbait on the bottom and slowly dragging it around. Swim jigs, spinnerbait, something that's going to keep the rod under load at all times. This rod is money. Super sensitive, but it has to have that bend to it to be able to really appreciate what it does. Now, the third rod in the Destroyer P5 line designed for a jig is this guy, and this is the Tachyon Shaft. Now, this rod is advertised as being the most sensitive, hardest hitting, fastest response jig rod ever made, right? Now, I don't know if it's that, but it lives up to the hype. It is very fast, it is very stiff, and things happen very quickly with this rod. And a lot of that reason is because of the length. This is an F6.5, okay? So it's a full power heavier than the X-Bite. So this would be more like an extra heavy, but it's only 6'7". So this rod was really designed for close range, quick stuff happening. Skipping a dock, pitching something up underneath something, right? Close range to where you're going to be, accuracy is going to be important, and sensitivity and things happening very quick, it needs to transfer, right? So because the rod is shorter, you're going to feel things faster, you're going to hit them quicker, the rod is very powerful, it's going to sit the hook, pull them away from cover. So if you're looking for a close range, kind of running bank, accurate, kind of skipping, pitching rod, Tachyon Shaft is dope. Swim jig, the Dark Sleeper. For open water and more, compact finesse type bottom contact in that 3/8 to 5/8 range, the X-Bites is where you're going to be. To highlight the key points of this, I love the X-Bites. I love the NRX. And these are the two rods that are constantly compared against each other. This rod, the NRX, is going to have an edge in sensitivity. The X-Bites is going to have an edge in performance and precision. So, you know, if you can feel everything, but you don't get the precision movements, you're not going to get as many bites. So you have to kind of decide, do you want that few extra percentage of sensitivity, or do you want the little extra precision that this rod can deliver you? And I can tell you, now that I've used this rod a lot, it is such a critical rod in my arsenal for this style bait. So if you guys find that you are throwing these little compact jigs, light little Texas rigs, I think you're going to find that you're going to love the X-Bites as well. So if you have any questions for me, hit me, drop it down below in the comments. I would be happy to answer it. And CJ will leave links to these rods if you want to check them out closer. And until next time, guys, thank you for watching. Thank you for the business. Thank you for the time. Enjoy the X-Bites. Enjoy the NRX. Enjoy any of these rods we talked about. They're all super dope, right? But the more you can micro dissect your line, the more you can enjoy more offerings from these brands, and I'm really excited to see where this goes for you. So happy fishing, everyone. Thanks for the time. Peace. Cheers.